Welcome to Massey Dialogue. Welcome to this new year. So today we're going to be discussing the art of science telling, the power of narratives for educating ourselves. I want to acknowledge that I am speaking from Massey College, situated on Indigenous land, the land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. It is the treaty land of the Mississaugas of the Credit, and we want to acknowledge all the time the great privilege that we have to continue to do this work. So without further ado, I'll want to invite Keshna Sood, a junior fellow at Massey College, whose brainchild this program is to lead us into it. Keshna.
Thank you so much, Principal DeRosier. Happy New Year, everyone, to who's watching and who will watch later. I hope 2022 will only be stronger from here. Thank you for joining us for the season, the premiere episode for the season 5 of the Massey Dialogues College podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about what science can learn from storytelling. Storytelling has been crucial to shaping our understanding of the world around us since the dawn of human history. Science, on the other hand, has shaped our ability to observe and experiment the exact world around us. This discussion will be focused on how science education, when delivered effectively, can help truly shape the society around us through supporting science education and policy decisions for the people of our communities. We're hoping that we can be extremely pertinent to the conditions around us and address not one, but two elephants in the room with our conversation with the broader theme in mind of health reform. We're hoping to be able to talk about COVID-19 and also how we can address health reform in the context of mental health policies as good examples. So with that, please welcome my guests of this hour. We have Dr. Bonnie Schmidt over from Let's Talk Science, Ms. Farah Qaiser, and Dr. Carolyn Tuohy. We're going to go around the table just once. We'll go ahead and introduce each of our guests, and then we'll get into the nitty-gritty of our conversation today. So, Farah, please go ahead.
Hi, everyone, and thank you all for tuning in. My name's Farah Qaiser, and I'm the Director of Research and Policy at Evidence for Democracy. Before I joined Evidence for Democracy, I completed a master's in genomics at the University of Toronto. I've written about science for media outlets. I've led Wikipedia editathons to create pages about historically excluded scientists, and I've co-founded the Toronto Science Policy Network. I'm really excited to be here today because a lot of what I do involves thinking about the current and the next generation of scientists, and I think science education is an important way that we can help reshape society as we're kind of slowly emerging out of the pandemic, but it's also an opportunity for scientists to think about how can we be broader, how can we think broader, how can we be more inclusive as we think about how to address so many of the faults that we've seen during the pandemic. I'll stop here.
Thank you so much. Welcome to the podcast, Farah. And Dr. Bonnie Schmidt, please tell us a little bit about yourself and your investment in science education.
Great. Thanks so much. Again, appreciate the opportunity to join this awesome panel to talk about one of my favorite subjects, which is Let's Talk Science and science education. I'm the president and founder of Let's Talk Science. It's an organization that I started 30 years ago now, back in the early 90s, to help bridge the gap between the scientific community and early childhood to grade 12 education. In my role, I lead strategy development of a team right across the country. We work with many volunteers, lots and lots of different partners. We really have tried to play the role of, say, connective tissue between the science community and the education community. My background is physiology. I have a PhD and started Let's Talk Science during an economic recession of the early 1990s, in which it became really clear that funding for research was being hit quite dramatically, and the scientific community was actually not reaching out. Communication with the public was not something that was done en masse, and so it was a really interesting place to start working with the community and try to bridge the gap. So now I'm really focused, as Farah was talking about, looking forward with science education and what really is the fundamental role of literacy, science literacy, citizenship, and how do we help kids prepare for a very different environment from the one that I grew up in and graduated into. Maybe with that, I'll pause.
Right on. And so, thinking about science education, one of the best ways to apply this is in the sphere of public policy, because those are the soft rules that are kind of implemented to help structure behavior and organizations that operate within it. So, with that, we've brought on our last guest for the show, Dr. Carolyn Tuohy. Please tell us about yourself and what your investment is in science education.
Well, thanks very much, Keshna, and thanks for setting that up so well. I think you've emphasized the importance of science in public policy. My name is Carolyn Tui. I'm a proud and longstanding Senior Fellow of Massey College. I'm a political scientist. I study public policy and particularly comparative policy. I think the best way to understand the drivers of policy change, which are my particular interests, the politics of policy change, the best way to understand that is by comparing cases across jurisdictions. I've also spent 13 years in the central administration in senior roles at the University of Toronto, and I was founding fellow of the School of Public Policy and Governance, which has now been merged into the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, where I'm currently ensconced. My work has taken two parallel directions, two interrelated directions recently. One is the role of science advice in the policy process, and the other is the power of narrative in the policy process. So I could not be more pleased to be involved in this discussion today.
Wonderful. Thank you both. Thank all three of you. So let's go ahead and begin to define exactly what we're talking about. So science education, at best. Bonnie, how would you describe the act of science education and how it's evolving today?
Yeah, I think that's actually kind of a loaded question that I do hope that we're able to explore more fully. If we think about the public education system in Canada, and it's been around for maybe about 150 years, it was really focused on developing kids for an agrarian economy, and how do we help, prepare lots of kids to do the exact same work over and over every year. And for many years, that the strategy of trying to create en masse the kind of skills for the economy at the time has worked quite well. And within that environment, science really became this subject, discipline-oriented, like subjects, biology, chemistry, physics, math, to try to create silos of information that would help young people develop the same kind of information, content knowledge typically, that was believed important for the economy at the time. When Let's Talk Science started, there was a big disconnect between the scientific community and the early childhood to grade 12 community, or just the formal education system. And it was the recognition at the time, again, 30 years ago now, that things were changing really quickly. And the idea of content knowledge, so just understanding the noun of science and the stuff of science, was becoming really clear that it wasn't going to do everybody justice as the economy was beginning to change. I will point out, too, that the year that Let's Talk Science started was really when the internet became a thing. And I think the only reason that I was successful at the time in launching this organization as a grad student was the advent of email. So if you put in the context, back then, when people were really thinking about science being subject-oriented, content knowledge for kids, and the recognition that things were going to start changing quickly, the idea of science education becoming more of a verb started to take root. And the idea that, science is a human endeavor, a way of asking questions of the world and a way of understanding our world, still to this day, I don't think is truly embraced. And I do think that as we continue on in the next hour, talking about the necessity of moving from, a noun, just teaching people lots of stuff about the way the world works, which was largely the first 100 years of science education, and moving into understanding science as a verb is underpinning the most pressing global challenges that we're facing now, and a way of thinking, knowing, and doing in Western science in particular, opens up a whole new way of thinking about how do we prepare people to build the skills and the knowledge that they need in order to be moving forward. So I think the other thing that we're missing that I'm hoping we might be able to touch on is the evolution of science education to do a better job for everybody in understanding risk and uncertainty, to help understand trust. And I think that's really become laid bare through the pandemic, and understanding why some people are having troubles of following the science, following the evidence, and continuing on with public health recommendations. So it is loaded. I'm hoping I laid the table a little bit for a variety of things that we could touch on in the next bit.
Certainly. I think the concept of the internet, the evolution of the internet, and also just understanding how science has evolved was certainly a learning lesson in the field for you. Farah, would you like to comment?
I mean, just to add on to what Bonnie was saying about following the evidence, I think we've seen in the pandemic that it's really hard to navigate who's an expert and who's not, and what is considered credible, what is considered science. And a lot of it does boil down to kind of having those science literacy skills, having that critical thinking, and really emphasizing those skills throughout education and beyond. And how we do that beyond is a question that I think about all the time. I feel like a lot of science education and outreach is focused and targeted towards young children, towards youth, but adults as a demographic are just as important. I don't know if anyone else wants to comment here.
I think the other thing I might add is around science education. Where we're at right now is a really interesting turning point. So the recognition that it's not just vertical domains, but that we need to do a better job of integrating. And this really points to the way that we're living and understanding issues around climate change, understanding how do we deal with epidemiology, how do we think about public health issues, and the connectedness of science with our lives. And coming back to what Carolyn was talking about the integration of science, evidence, and policy making, I think is, from my perspective, has really never become more clear. In my world of education, policy is the curriculum. So how do we think about defining what is believed to be important from a subject discipline, and then how do we link that into areas of public policy? And Farah is absolutely right. We can't think about education as ending when kids graduate out of grade 12 or graduate out of post-secondary, but how do we think about helping the general public continue to become more and more literate so they can participate in meaningful ways?
I think there's a lot to be said about policy being a means for change in society, and for schools and curriculums being almost a microcosm of a policy environment where you're sustaining that change. Do you think that this concept of evidence-based decision making is an ideal standard that every organization should prescribe to or aspire to, or do you think that it is something that needs to be orchestrated from the top down?
I wonder if I can leap in at this point. A number of policy scholars have distinguished between what they call the realm of expert knowledge, people with either systematic knowledge or long experience in a field, and what they call everyday knowledge. So expert knowledge tends to be systematic, logical, analytical. Everyday knowledge is much more inductive, ad hoc. It's based on everyday experience. Both of these types of knowledge are important in the policy process. They tend to be seen as in opposition to each other, but they can in fact be quite complementary. As one scholar put it, everyday knowledge can offer a kind of field test for the practicality of expert knowledge. As another scholar Sheila Jasanoff has put it, what scientists have to offer in the policy process is a serviceable truth. That is to say, a truth that can withstand the tests of science, but is not necessarily pushing the frontiers of science. It is offering a basis for action in the real world when it is needed. So we need to connect both expert knowledge and ordinary knowledge or everyday knowledge in the policy process.
So that's really interesting. You mentioned that, Carolyn, because Farah is a leading example of that, of someone who has been trained in science but has kind of jumped ship and entered the sphere of policy. So, Farah, what would you say to people that are trying to kind of do this? Do you think integrated training is the way forward? Have you envisioned some pitfalls that you didn't imagine when you were in the Department of Molecular Genetics finishing your master's and then entering the sphere of policy? Is there something that you think was advantageous going from a science field into the world of policy and not the inverse?
I mean, I was very lucky during my master's that I was surrounded by very supportive people and that folks kind of helped me along as I explored these different fields. And the only reason I was really able to take that detour into policy was because I ended up co-founding the Toronto Science Policy Network. So I really got a crash course into the world of policy as a result. After my master's, I actually spent the year, so it was 2020 pandemic in full flow. I spent the year working at the University Health Network's Epilepsy Genetics Clinic, as well as Evidence for Democracy as a researcher. So I kind of had one foot in the world of science and one foot in the world of policy. And that was really interesting because I could see what was happening in hospitals, all the kind of panic, the worry, the struggle, all of that hard work that was going in. And I could also see it from the policy world, what was happening, what wasn't happening, how evidence was trying to be marshaled into making policy decisions. And it has been helpful. It's helpful to know as a scientist what are the issues in, looking at PCR tests and like navigating all these different numbers and statistics. But then in the policy world, kind of understanding there's such quick deadlines that you can't just follow the science, but there are other inputs that you have to consider, such as societal views, economics, public, and so much more. So having a foot in kind of both worlds has been really useful in understanding the world of policy. And I think we kind of need more of this as we go forward. We need to have more rounded education so that scientists are walking away with a clearer picture of what the world of policy looks like. It's not just a matter of publishing your research and saying, hey, this is it, you should use it in your decisions. But it's actually about kind of marshaling evidence through government. So figuring out what is it that elected representatives need? How is your evidence, how is your piece going to fit in there, and building long-term relationships with policymakers, with decision makers, with elected representatives to really keep that relationship between science and policy going.
And so, with your time in dealing with, I guess, a number of different stakeholders in your capacities as someone at the TSPN, and also working as a master's student and then later on at Evidence for Democracy, do you think that there are, based on the type of policy decision you're trying to influence, a different amount of effort that different stakeholders have to put in to understand properly how exactly they can communicate the change effectively that they'd like to do? I'm assuming that based on different types of policy changes, and Carolyn, I'm going to need you to tap in to tell us a little bit about the patterns you see in policy changes. And I know that's summarizing decades of work in a very quick few sentences, but if you could just lead us through that, Carolyn, and then Farah could maybe emphasize how her different stakeholders, and Bonnie as well, how both of your different stakeholders in your capacity being involved in science outreach would maybe tie into those different level of policy changes. So Carolyn, first, please tell us the different types of policy change patterns you see, both in terms of scale and pace, as well as Farah and Bonnie after.
So two key decisions to make: how big to go and how fast to go. And that decision depends not so much on the nature of the policy. It actually depends on how politicians read their own positions of power, what they think they can do, what coalitions they think they can build in the present, and how they think they can sustain those coalitions over time. If they perceive themselves to be quite powerful in the present, but at risk of losing power very quickly, they will likely go for what I've called a big bang approach. Try to get a big change through when you are powerful enough to do it. Or you may not, in fact, be quite powerful enough to get agreement on a big change in the present, but you can do a whole lot of small deals really fast. I call that a mosaic change. That is, for example, the pattern of the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, in the US. A big bang is more like the foundation of the National Health Service in the UK after the First World War. If you are in a policymaker's dream world, you can do what I call a blueprint, which is to say you can decide where you want to get in the long term, a big change, but you can do it in stages as the necessary conditions come online. This is the way the Dutch managed their healthcare reform over 20 years, from the late 80s to to 2006. And finally, if you're in a position of power, but you think you'll be even in a better position in the future, you may just choose to do an incremental change and take advantage of your even better position in the future. So it's that kind of politically strategic thinking that goes into creating these different patterns of scale and pace. It also means that those who want to influence policy have to adopt different strategies in these moments. There's no point in attempting a big bang change if you're in a mosaic moment, for example. So you need to be pretty clever about recognizing what incentives policymakers are actually facing. I can say a bit more about that later in the conversation, but let me leave it at that for now.
So, Carolyn, do you think that you, in understanding this research, do you think that you have uncovered something really great, which is that, the vast majority of policy being a means for change isn't actually happening for the cause of the policy, and actually it's happening for the cause of the way politicians perceive their power. This seems to be a very huge finding, right? Because a lot of the ways policies and rules are conducted, I mean, in Ontario right now, we're certainly facing the brink of policy decisions that maybe everyone doesn't feel comfortable with, but also that a lot of people just don't understand where the rationales are coming from. And so in a situation like this, I can certainly see the ripple effect down the line for another elephant in the room, mental health, and how policy decisions should be made. Do you think that the government should have, at least the nonpartisan side, more control over these decisions in the future?
I think that politicians, there are different types of policy moments. This is clearly an extraordinary moment that we're in. I'm frankly not sure how well my framework, which is developed for more normal periods of public policy, applies to the emergency conditions of a pandemic. I think that the nature of the problem is so great that it can override short-term political incentives. That being said, in Ontario, we are dealing with a government that is very much looking toward the next election and knows that it will be judged on its pandemic performance. So I think that the incentives in this moment may be distinct to the politics of emergencies, but nonetheless, we have to take political incentives into account. I could toss it over to my co-panelists to pitch in on that point.
I wanted to continue the point that you were saying about pre-pandemic. So this is an emergency. It's so hard to know what still applies and what doesn't. But before the pandemic, at Evidence for Democracy, we actually did a study where we interviewed MPs, so members of parliament at the federal level, to understand how they use science and evidence in their work. We spoke to a number of MPs, we spoke to their staffers, we asked them questions about, how do you find information? How do you find these different sources? What do you decide is considered credible? What is considered reliable? And what are the challenges you face? And we heard a lot of common themes. We heard about how MPs, they're just like us, they're people. They will turn to sources like Google, they will turn to sources like the internet, they will ask their constituents, they will ask the Library of Parliament. That's where they're turning to for information. But they're navigating these pieces of information amid so many restrictions. So they don't have a lot of time. They don't necessarily have the credentials needed to, to navigate all of these scientific papers and all of this jargon. And then on top of it, they don't have a lot of staff or manpower. So it's basically, they described it as an information overload with not enough supporting resources. And that's something to keep in mind if you're thinking about engaging with your decision makers. Keep in mind that they don't have a lot of time, they're receiving a lot of information. How are you going to position yourself in this environment? You're going to have to kind of think about being snappy, coming with your key points first, and trying to make the best use of the time that you have. And now imagine the pandemic on top of it. There are so many impossible decisions to make that won't make you a friend to anyone. Nobody is going to agree with the decisions you make, and you're doing this with political incentives in mind or not. So it is a very difficult situation, and I would be very curious to hear about how decisions are being made in this time. I will tell you that part of my research at Evidence for Democracy right now does involve trying to understand whether the members of the public can actually find the evidence behind policy decisions. So, can we actually see why a policymaker made the decision they did? Did they consider alternative options? How transparent is all of this? Because we talk a lot about evidence-informed decision making, but without transparency, it's really hard to see what evidence is going into these decisions. So these are some of the things that I'm thinking about, and I'm very curious to see how the pandemic is affecting all of this. I'll stop here and pass it over to Bonnie in case she has any comments.
Yeah, actually, just to pick up on what you were just talking about, Farah, we definitely see more now about people questioning decisions that are being made right across the country about, well, are we actually following the science now, and show us the evidence. So I think even the shift in mindset from in the general public to be asking questions about show us the evidence and are you actually following the science is really, it's different. We're almost starting to get used to it now, and seeing public health officials out, seeing the chief medical officers come out and talk about cases and actually talk about the pandemic itself in scientific terms. Like if you just think back 2 years ago, it would have been completely something you'd never think that you'd see these doctors on television going through graphs and charts and explaining admission rates and caseloads and R0 and whatnot. So it's really been pretty remarkable. But I wouldn't mind just going back for a second to pull together a comment that Keshna made with one of Carolyn's observations about policy and politics. And Keshna made the comment about whether there were some more policy decisions that needed to potentially become in the domain of the neutral civil servants versus the political or the elected officials. And we definitely see in education how education itself becomes or can become a political issue when, in fact, as we're starting to look at how do you actually change curriculum for long-term success, it really is something that needs to be kind of game planned out for years and not over mandates. And so that I think it is a really important issue that Carolyn had raised about how are we making, what is the scale, what is the timeline for policy-based decisions, who should be making those decisions, and how do we actually feed in the appropriate evidence. So with science education, for example, at the age group that we think about, if we look forward to when kids that Let's Talk Science is working with, right, really young, right through high school, they're not going to be hitting the workforce. They're not even going to be voting for a few years. How do we think about the kind of curriculum that should be in place now to prepare them for what is going to be likely to be faced in 5 years, 10 years, or whatever, and to have that in a political domain and changing on a regular basis can actually be kind of problematic. So hearing more from Carolyn about the politics and the policy and how do you weave evidence, what is the role of folks like us and organizations like Evidence for Democracy and Let's Talk Science I think it's really important and pretty complicated to navigate.
I think that's a really important set of questions, Bonnie. The public understanding of science, let me back up. I think that the notion that policy should follow the science has actually misled a lot of the public conversation. Science is evolving. Science, by its very nature, evolves. Science is about dissent. As someone said recently, the first thing you do as a scientist when you have a finding is do your best to disprove it. Alan Bernstein gave a great lecture for the inaugural Massey CFAR lectures on the role of science in public policy, in which he entitled it "Doubt Everything." So the science process, the process of science advice for policy is about organizing scientific dissent to mobilize a consensus around a recommendation that can provide the basis for action in the present. But the notion that there is some scientific truth handed down from Olympus that must be followed in the policy process is very misleading for the public. And I think that we need to educate ourselves through this process about what the scientific process really looks like and what we can expect and cannot expect from scientists in this context. And I think the roles that both of you and your related organizations are playing is absolutely critical in this process. We need civil society engaged to buffer these conversations.
If I could just jump in to say I couldn't agree with you more. And in fact, given that I have a PhD, and so it wasn't really until the advanced training that you start to truly understand the process of science and the risk and the uncertainty and the fact that it really is a human-made framework for trying to understand how the world works. So this whole idea of, from Olympus, your comment was absolutely bang on. And I think for me, as a trained scientist looking at the social structure and not really realizing how little understanding the general public actually has about the true nature of science, the processes of science, and this whole concept of risk and uncertainty. So we've really doubled down to try to ensure that the programming that we do is really reinforcing to young people at an early age that it's a human-made process for understanding the world around us. And that even that mind shift really allows us to think about Western science as a way of knowing and doing, which opens up a new inclusive way of thinking about what are other ways of knowing about how the world works. And it suddenly builds this whole different framework of exploring answers and different solutions, right? Like evidence from a Western science perspective is so quantitative. It's all about numbers, it's all about dissent, it's all about disproving. But when we start thinking about other ways, like Indigenous ways of knowing, which is much more qualitative and issues focused, you can start to see really natural synergistic connections between these different frames, all human-made frames of knowing and thinking.
If I can add one last comment here, is that this conversation is reminding me of a remark that Canada's Chief Science Advisor, Dr. Mona Nemer, made recently. And she pointed out that during the pandemic, what we've really been doing is we've been both helping the public learn about the process of science as well as sharing those findings. So we've kind of been on this collective journey to understand R0, PCR tests, false negatives, false positives. And Dr. Nemer just made this point about, when it's peacetime, perhaps we should spend more time talking about the process of science, the why and the how of science, so that if an emergency like this pops up, and we know that it's coming, we know that we're living through climate change right now, in those instances, we won't have to focus as much on communicating how the science is done and can kind of jump into the findings and really focus more on action and mitigation.
Yeah, the proactivity nature of civic duty related to understanding science in general, and also just being able to communicate and understand the news as it comes, certainly seems like we need to spend more time teaching people from first principles what it means to think scientifically and what it means to follow the scientific process rather than wait until crisis time to almost regurgitate and almost cram copious amounts of information because it's a time of panic. From the audience, we have a question that reads, Dr. Fauci has been one of the most prominent science communicators and educators in the world for the last 2 years. What are some of the lessons we can take from his performance? Maybe we'll start with Bonnie for this.
Sure. Oh, I love it. He has been a rock star. It's just, I've been so impressed watching him. And I think, like, did you see him on the cover of some of the popular culture magazines and whatnot? I think what he did absolutely brilliantly was to really understand the story, to not feel that he needed to fire hose everybody with every bit of detail that we might know about it, but to get people to lean in. And this whole idea about when you're communicating science, one of the best successes is people lean in and want to know more and ask more questions. And I think he did a brilliant job of being accessible, about not sounding like he was on Olympus and on high, of qualifying his answers around certainty and uncertainty and about what we know at this point in time. But for me, it was about having a very straightforward message, not losing his patience, saying it over and over again in ways that I thought was really accessible. And he went to where the audiences were, or where the audiences are. I heard him on late night talk shows. I saw him on television. I heard him on podcasts. I saw him in all sorts of public media. And scientists would do well to understand where are the people that we want to be communicating with and what is the best way to tell the story to make it relevant and authentic. And I think he did that so well. You can tell I'm a Fauci fan, right?
If I might just jump in, keep in mind, however, that he was also the target of death threats and probably continues to be. So I think one of the reasons for his prominence, and I don't take anything away from his ability as a science communicator, which I think is masterful, but one of the reasons for his predominance in the media was that he played into a narrative in the highly polarized context of the U.S. He was a hero who stood up against an administration that was beloved by some and detested by others. And so keep in mind that he would not likely have had the prominence that he has, notwithstanding, as I say, his skill as a science communicator, had he not played into that powerful narrative.
I feel like Bonnie covered everything about Fauci, but two things that I want to add is that Dr. Fauci was willing to be human. He was willing to have human reactions. He was willing to just be himself. And I think that really shone through, and that just made him more approachable, more genuine. And I think a second thing that I especially admire about Dr. Fauci is that he was willing to kind of give the spotlight to folks who had done the work. So his attention towards kind of the next generation of scientists, towards pointing to who has done the work and who's doing well. And I think that was also just a way of kind of extending flowers to the people who had done work and just helped him gain a lot more respect. So there are a lot of reasons why Dr. Fauci is an incredible science communicator. And I hope that throughout the pandemic that a lot of scientists who have seen him really shine are now just as motivated to go build those science communication skills, because everything that Dr. Fauci's done, that takes time. It's not like he woke up overnight and knew how to break down complex science into such accessible terms. He's been really exercising the science communication muscle for years and years to come. And that's something that you're going to have to exercise every time you publish a paper, every time you tweet about your paper to the world, every time you talk about your science to your family or your loved ones. And if we're aspiring to be, half as good of a science communicator as Dr. Fauci, then these are skills that we need to build into our education systems. And it just shouldn't start in graduate school. It should be right there from high school and undergraduate degrees.
I love this. Two things. I think Dr. Fauci was great in a lot of the ways he handled situations in the pandemic. But Carolyn mentioned a really good point that he did choose a narrative. And I also want to point out that, Sean Paul did mention that this is like the last word in your sentence is interesting, right? Because it's what lessons can we take from his performance? And I think when you're a political leader or a leader in a leader as part of the NIH or leading a nation or being the spokesperson for almost anything, you almost do have to perform in a way. So you can't stay in that practice zone and that human zone for too long, because then you're not a credible scientist as far as the public is concerned. And so I think Fauci did a really good, he demonstrated a really good balance between being that humanistic person and also distilling information at the relevant time for the public. I don't think that we will have a perfect example of someone leading our global crises in the future. I think that when we have a time of crisis, it's best to figure out what we can do, but also change the public attitude about the fact that no one will know and no one should be held accountable for their words, undoubtedly, because the science is evolving, and because a lot of what we're learning and a lot of what we're saying is changing. And so like I think back to one of the first things in 2020 where the N95 masks and then the no masks were kind of mandated, and I think that's kind of a good example of a way to oversimplify and almost miss the point completely in public communications of science, which is why I kind of keep sticking to this first principles idea of even educating the public about scientific thinking, devoid and separate from science as a practice and the ability to conduct activities to experiment and observe. The way to think and process information, like Bonnie has mentioned, science being a verb, seems to be a really good way to teach people to understand and also be tolerant to new information while critically thinking about it. A question from Natalie DeRosier, our principal, mentions a concern, which is politicians have used science as truth to legitimate a lot of their actions on COVID-19. Will science survive? And I guess we'll take this question to Farah first, and then maybe Carolyn, and then Bonnie, if you have anything to add.
I mean, my response is that I want to see how the science has actually been used. It's really hard as an outsider to see how evidence has been used in decision making because there isn't a lot of transparency. We don't really understand kind of the chain of reasoning that led to a decision, what evidence was used or what evidence wasn't used. So before I can even kind of start to answer that question, I just really want to know, how was evidence being used in decision making? Was it used at all? And then we can kind of figure out where to go from here.
And in terms of the question of,
I think I was next on the roster. So I would like to, in answering this, I'd like to distinguish between what Sheila Jasanoff calls science in action and science for action. I'm quite confident that science in action is in no jeopardy, is going to survive. Science, and that is to say, discovery-based science, pushing the frontiers of knowledge. Science for action, science advice in the policy process. We need to learn from this episode how to do this better. And I think we can. I think that there's been a massive engagement of scientists in the policy process, massive in relative terms to what it has been in the past. I think we can learn about what went right and what went wrong in this period and try to institutionalize some of that learning in new organizations and new networks that bring together scientists, civil society, and government. I'm actually quite optimistic about our ability to learn from this episode to make some of those changes.
The only thing I would add to that is that the idea of science and truth in and of itself is something we have to be careful about bringing together. But I think the other thing around the political use of science advice is that science and evidence is only one aspect of what goes into the decision-making process when it comes to developing policy. And perhaps the pendulum through the pandemic has swung so much to the science and the portrayal of the scientific community in solving the issue, which I have to say has been absolutely unbelievable thing to watch, the genome to be sequenced and then the vaccines to be developed. But perhaps we haven't been clear enough with the public about all the other factors that go into policymaking. And it's not just scientific evidence that's causing the politicians to make all the decisions that are being made.
And I think that point that you just raised, Bonnie, it's something that not all scientists appreciate yet either. Science isn't, it's not just about following the science, it's about considering the bigger picture and using science as just one of those inputs. And I think that's really a lesson that we all have to appreciate a little bit more.
And Bonnie, where do you think the appropriate place would be for people to make use and also for people to learn where science fits in the policy decision making table, or how to understand science as a way of thinking? Do you think that there's room for that in the early stage curriculum of young learners of Canadians in the future, maybe?
Well, I think the latter for sure, about how science works, what are the limitations to science, again, that it is a human endeavor that helps us structure our understanding of the world. I think we need to start that in early childhood, frankly, and kids are very capable at understanding ambiguity and risk and uncertainty. When it comes to more around the political nature of decision making, I think that is more complicated. And I even think back to my own education and just how little in school I understood and learned about the whole process of civic engagement and political decision making. And even now, how it's been really being part of the system. It's taken a long time to truly understand it. So I think we could probably do a better job, all of us, in helping the public understand that there are many inputs. I think Farah phrased it really, really well, that scientific evidence is one of the inputs. It might have incredible weighting in some situations, but it's never the only input into policy making.
If any of us, let's say the team of the three panelists we have here today, were to design a curriculum in the future for early childhood education, do you think that teaching younger students how science can be interpreted as information is certainly something we can do, but do you think teaching very young people would be beneficial, even before their voting age, to understand where policy decisions come from? Or do you think we should still wait until students are about a high school age or by that voting age to learn? Because I feel like it's almost too late at that point, and I'm trying to understand how you feel.
Well, I'll start with just, I absolutely agree. In the early years, we need to be doing it. And Let's Talk Science has been starting young for a very long time. I think as we face the issue of climate change, and we're seeing the activism and the action of young people, largely teenagers, or even grade 7 and up, it's happening. They're learning, they're engaging with the political process at younger and younger ages, and it's around issues. So I think it is really important that we do our utmost to help to inform and engage them in ways that allow their voices to shine through and allow them to be really productive participants in the policy making that goes forward. So yeah, absolutely. I think they're very capable. Maybe not early childhood on policy stuff, but for sure within later elementary and high school. Absolutely.
And thinking to our adult learners within the Canadian community, what is, like, I'm trying to think out loud here, what is a reasonable place for people to go and learn this information in a community-based setting? Everyone's got the internet at their fingertips and they can learn through maybe unvetted sources of information. But do you think this is something that the government should be teaching? Do you think that this is something that educators should take on under their belts? Or do you think that this is something that people should kind of learn through an open and free market. Carolyn.
Well, let me pick the first two. I think governments can be doing more to support curricular change, for example. But I think, as I've been saying throughout, there is a really important role for civil society organizations here. I'll give a shout out to Mass LPB, Citizens Assembly consultancy that Peter McLeod and his colleagues have been so successful with, bringing people together, exposing them to evidence and evidence-based debate, and asking them to be involved in making policy recommendations. I think we can do a lot more of this throughout society at different ages. And I really want to close by emphasizing the role of these civil society organizations, and taking my hat off to my two co-panelists in that regard.
Right on. And we are coming to our closing time, so I guess we can conclude with that sentiment. There needs to be more policy decision-making learning, and also scientific learning at an early age, more as a verb and not just as an activity that you use to find something or consolidate some new pieces of information. So panelists, please, thank you. I would like to thank you for your time during this hour. I think we don't have any questions in the chat right now. But if anyone wants to put in a question or two, you're more than welcome to at this moment. But if there isn't anything else, let's go ahead and start with Farah, Bonnie, and then Carolyn with your parting sentiments. Any thoughts you'd like to leave the audience with? One or two key points, maybe?
I mean, I feel like at this point, there are so many different lessons to learn from the pandemic, which is still continuing. We're not out of this yet. But I think we've been waiting far too long to put so many of these solutions to practice. We know that we want more scientists to practice inclusive science communication. We know we want to talk more about civics and democracy and civic engagement, and so many of the different solutions that we've talked about in this panel today. We don't have to wait around any longer. And especially with climate action at our doorstep, we shouldn't be waiting around any longer. So my kind of closing message to anyone who's tuning in today is that whatever your niche is, whether you're a researcher, whether you're a student, there is probably some way that you can get involved beyond your current bubble. How can you kind of contribute to helping better shape society? How can you help to better improving our community? Whether that's volunteering, whether that's writing an op-ed, whether that's simply listening to the news and breaking down all of these different developments that are happening in more accessible language to your loved ones, that's something that you can do, because it's 2022 and it feels really hard right now to see kind of your way out of the pandemic, but I have hope in kind of all of us. It's going to be our little actions that will help better shape society. It's going to take all of us, from nonprofits to professors to students, and that's what I'm looking forward to in 2022. That's my cliched message. I will pass it on to someone else.
Bonnie.
Sure, thanks. I'm not sure I can be any more eloquent than Farah just was. I think for me, it's about building on her message to say that we are coming through a pandemic, and after 3 decades in the space of science education, I've never actually seen a global mobilization towards a common issue which science is underpinning, right? How we've figured out some of the challenges, how we made the vaccines, how we've actually pulled together. And it's like the community is more open to understanding more about science as we go forward. So I really hope that we can action the unifying force, ways of knowing that science can help us to deal with tackling climate change, for example, and use some of the lessons that we have been learning over the last 18 months or so to put them into action. Everybody does have a role. Science is not the exclusive way of coming at understanding how the world is working, but it's a pretty powerful machine. And the more that we understand and talk about it using the same framework and the same lens, I think we are actually going to be able to work together to solve other critical crises that we are facing, and including climate change.
Thank you very much.
And I'd like to just endorse that. I think that this is such an important moment for learning. We have seen very visible scientists, very visible science communicators, not just Dr. Fauci or Scott Gottlieb in the U.S., but others, our own scientists, Staney Brown, Peter Uni in Ontario, and David Naylor at the federal level. We've seen. The public has seen scientists taking leading roles in policy advice in a way that is rarely the case. So I think we can reflect on this moment, what we've learned from this moment, how we can institutionalize some of that learning in a new process for science advising and public understanding.
Thank you very much to all our panelists. And I'll conclude the discussion by emphasizing the common thread among all of the different identities we have on the table, all of the different disciplines, the stakeholders, the experiences, and the policy decision-making processes that we have. The underlying thread is just humans working together. So language, empathy, are really key elements. And I know it sounds cliche. I know it sounds like you've heard it 100 times, but truly, truly being tolerant to one another and understanding the perspectives that people are bringing to the table is highly crucial. And I think that a lot of our scientific learning and understanding will come from a shift in attitude. And that attitude is understanding that the fastest way there is slow. And understanding information from the first principle will always be much better than understanding information in a fast, quick, and easy way. It's kind of like the way you do science, right? A quick and dirty experiment versus one that's planned rigorously. And so if you really want to get a good understanding of how policy decisions are made, it truly comes from the fact that you'd want to understand at a global scale where things are being done correctly and maybe where things can be improved. And that comes from having the attitude of remaining a learner and being willing to be wrong and maybe right in some cases. So with that, everyone, I want to thank my panelists once again. Farah, Dr. Schmidt, Dr. Tui, your presence has been greatly appreciated. I've learned a lot as well, and I truly hope you enjoyed the hour, and I look forward to our next conversation soon. So I hope everyone enjoyed learning a bit more about how science telling can be leveraged to make a better society. And I hope that this discussion has been useful and helpful to everyone watching.